Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Buenos dias, damas y caballeros. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sung-Hoon Kim, and I'll be your MC for this event. I'd like to welcome all of you to the International Civil Aviation Organization's 40th Assembly SkyTalks. Over the course of a 2-week period, we have 68 presentations by aviation industry professionals, and ranging from all sorts of topics. So I would invite you to check out the ICAO channel on YouTube. Today is day 6, session number 2, and we have easily one of the most interesting topics of the day. We're going to talk about how ICAO in the States prevent infectious disease in air travel. I would like you to welcome Dr. Ansa Jordaan, Chief of the Aviation Medicine Section. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. And thank you for saying that this is an interesting topic, because I was going to say that I think it's the most interesting topic for the whole conference, but I might be biased. So let's see what I want to tell you about. And this is not working. Okay. Transmission of disease. Why do I have that? Okay. Let's try again. There we go. Transmission of disease. A very quick reminder how disease gets transmitted. And all of these can be transmitted in the aviation environment, just in case you wondered, animals too. What is the operational impact of infectious disease? Because in aviation industry, aviation medicine is always the orphan in aviation. And if we talk about infectious disease and public health, there's even less knowledge about that. So if we don't manage infectious disease properly, this is what will happen in aviation. You'll have flight delays. When we had Zika, we had additional technical requirements. So states were required to disinfect their aircrafts with additional spraying methods. So that meant for some states to take the aircraft out of circulation, having it done in a different state that actually allows the type of disinfectants that we were talking about, and then put them back into circulation. So there's a lot of cost implications there as well. And of course, if people don't attend or come to work in the aviation industry, it does have an effect on safety. What about the economical impact? The graph on the left is about SARS in Hong Kong. And that was when WHO imposed a travel ban on passengers. And you can see the sharp drop in passengers. And if you look at the right-hand side and you look at the economic impact on that, on the top graph shows the Asia-Pacific Airlines. And the difference between the black and the red line is specifically the impact that SARS had on their budget, on their revenue for that period. And America, being much further away from where the impact was in Asia Pacific, also had some very bad effects, as you can see from the bottom graph. These are the things we're talking about. Top line, we spoke about SARS, we have avian flu, we had swine flu, you all know about Ebola, Zika, and the last few years we had yellow fever, plague, more Ebola, more measles. The bottom part of the line shows what ICAO, the states, WHO, CDC, how we have reacted to try and manage these diseases. And I will show you a little bit later in the presentation some examples of what we've done. But I'm glad to say that we are now not anymore in the reactive mode, but in the proactive mode. So we are actually winning, I think. Ebola. This is an interesting slide. In the years 1976 to 2012, this is a period of 30 years. And to look in Africa, because we only had Africa statistics at that stage. And in DRC, for that period spanning more than 30 years, we had a total of 987 cases, for example. Ebola was restricted to Africa. Now we come to 2014, 2019, 5 years. We have had some distribution to Europe, to America. Not a lot of cases, very few cases, but it's there. And the fact that it's there means it can spread everywhere else. And the alarming thing is, if you look at the cases, so Sierra Leone, we have 14,000 cases over a period of 5 years. At the moment, we have an outbreak ongoing in Democratic Republic of Congo. We have a count now of 3,000. It is still escalating. The problem in with Ebola in the Congo at the moment is it's not just the disease. There's many other factors. There are violence going on. There's other humanitarian problems that's happening at the moment. There is political issues that's going on. There's some corruption that has been going on. So at the moment, DRC is battling with not only Ebola, they also have a measles outbreak and they also have a cholera outbreak. Now for us on this side of the world in Americas, we say, oh, it's not that far. We don't have that much traffic from Ebola, from Africa to Europe and America. But it has happened, it has spread, and we need to be ready for that. The other issue with Ebola is it's differently transmitted than measles, for example. Ebola, you have to have direct contact with body fluids or persons. Measles gets transmitted through the air. And what you can see here, if we look at Europe and we look at the United States, there has been a sharp increase in measles cases in both these areas. Various reasons for that. But again, the problem with measles is you can be on an aircraft and you would not know that a person is sick because a person can be infective before they start getting symptoms. So we need to know that we have procedures in place so that if we get informed there was a measles case on an aircraft, how are we going to react to that? How are we going to trace those passengers on the flight? What information are we giving to them? This is our role. So what is ICAO doing? ICAO has implemented a program called CAPSCA, which is all about preventing and mitigating the effects of communicable diseases. It has spread a little bit further now than just communicable diseases. We're looking at radiation, we're looking at chemical spills, we're looking at bioterrorism. That's another issue that's really coming up with the security nowadays. For us, the main role is the collaboration between the public health sector and the aviation sector, because each of us has a role to play. And the UN and the WHO CDC focuses on the public health impact, whereas we need to focus on transport, the travel, and the economic impact. But we cannot do this in isolation. If we don't work together, we cannot stop or mitigate the effects of a communicable disease outbreak. There are regulations, and this is just to give you the broad overview. CAPSCA is a voluntary organization. We ask states to belong to that. But what CAPSCA does, it helps states to implement regulations. So again, we're talking about public health and aviation. On an international level, we have international health regulations. We have the ICAO standards. There's some other global organizations that we need to look at. But then it goes down to a national level. And from a national perspective, again, it's working together, aviation, public health, and if you look at the aviation component, they need to have their regulations needs to refer to how they're going to manage with public health issues. They need to have a national aviation plan for a public health emergency. And the same with the health area of it. And then we go to the aviation more specific, and you can see that we are looking at aerodromes, the airlines, air traffic procedures, business continuity plans. All of these needs to be in place. For states, just that you know that if ICAO go and do a USOAP audit, one of the questions is whether you have a national aviation plan and whether it does address public health emergencies. Okay, so this is the regulatory boring stuff. Let's get to the interesting stuff. What do we do to mitigate the spread of infectious disease? So we're going to do a circle for the journey only, but remember the person is already traveling by car or by metro or by bus to the airport. So people often say that aircraft is the vector of disease, and that is not true. A vector is an organism. It is a mosquito or an insect, and the aircraft, we carry the people. So the human is the vector of disease, not the aircraft. So we need to detect the human, and that is what we're all about. We have 3 pillars. We're looking at the human, we are looking at the real vectors, which is the mosquitoes, and we're looking at the aircraft surfaces. So let's see what we do at the originating airport. International health regulations require that the airport must be free of vectors for a 400 perimeter outside of the airport. So they need to have pest control programs in place. They need to see whether they have mosquitoes. They need to do surveillance. They need to have programs in place to do the spraying. And that sounds easy enough, but it's not. Because in some African airports, like, for example, Antananarivo in Madagascar, you will have the local people that have their rice paddies next to the airport. And you have the normal national regulations, and then you have the elders of the villages. And there has to be a big communication between the elders of the villages and the local government, because as soon as you start spraying these rice paddies to get rid of mosquitoes, you endanger their livelihood. So it's not so easy to say, make sure that you have programs in place to prevent mosquitoes around the airport. Then when we are at the airport and you see someone who actually looks sick, it's easy because then you can identify that person. You can tell him to go quickly for an examination at the airport. You can ask him to delay travel. And we train the airport staff to look at that. Now when we get to the boarding process, the same thing. So once the person arrives at the airport, he gets his ticket, he goes through the boarding gate, he goes into the aircraft. So there's a few places where someone can detect if someone is really sick and can put something in place to do that. At the end of the day, it is the captain's prerogative to decide whether he takes this patient on board or not. So that's something that we almost must remember. So if you identify a person, you can take him for a health assessment. You can see what the problem is, especially with long flights. You don't want a sick person on board, especially if you don't know what the diagnosis is. You might have to divert. You might have to do CPR on a flight. So it's really good to see what you have on board. The other thing, when we have an outbreak, like Ebola, for example, the airports in Kinshasa, all the international airports in DRC, we have airports in Uganda, Tanzania, they do border control, so they do health screening. Health screening depends on the disease. So with Ebola, you would typically complete a questionnaire, and they would see whether they might do a temperature check. And there's a lot of debate on the value of temperature checks on screening measures. So that's another thing that we look at. And it works because during this Ebola outbreak, we had a person that went from Ebola, from DRC to Uganda, boarded a flight for China via Dubai. And we found out, WHO and CDC, because they do the contact tracing, they found out that this person has been exposed to Ebola. But he did not say it on his declaration. So then our process kicks in on how to identify that person and what do we do. And again, this is where the collaboration between all the stakeholders comes in. Some of the states do have a list to deny travel or deny boarding in case of some infectious diseases. So if you are a known person being treated for tuberculosis and you're at a point where you can still be infectious, then you will not be allowed to board the flight. So some of these measures are in place. Then now we're in the flight, the passenger got on board. Again, the crew are trained. So they will identify a suspected case. There's certain procedures they need to follow. So they need to inform the captain of the aircraft. He's got certain procedures he has to follow, which you will see in the next slide. And then the cabin crew has certain measures they need to do. So the most important one I did not put on there is the protection of the cabin crew themselves. So they should not approach a sick person without having a mask, without having gloves, because you don't know what this person has that you're approaching. The other problem with communicable diseases is you don't know whether it's an infectious disease. It might be something totally different. The person might have a flu that is not transmitted, or he might have bronchitis, or whatever the case might be, or he might have a heart attack. Some symptoms of heart attack is sweating, fever. So it's very important for cabin crew to protect themselves. And then they have a list of symptoms that we teach them. And if there's a certain amount of that symptoms, then they have to treat it as a communicable disease. And then there's certain procedures they need to follow. Some of that would include, where do they put the passenger? It's the same when we have an outbreak of gastroenteritis on board. I mean, if you have 2 or 3 people who are sick, what do you do with them? Because you need to isolate them from the other passengers. So, and we have, with our CAPSCO, we do training. We have training scenarios where we teach them how to manage that. So, and it's very much dependent on the type of aircraft you have, on the layout of the aircraft, how many people are actually on the flight. Do you move a sick passenger to business class? Do you move them to economy? Do you put them in a toilet? It's really dependent on the situation. And sad to say, there has been cases of death on board, and it's another issue. It's what you do with a body on the aircraft, especially if you've got a 10 or 12-hour flight. So we prepare the cabin crew for this. Then, if they think there is an infectious disease on board, they might hand out masks to the passengers. They might restrict passengers. So for tuberculosis, our rule is 2 rows in front and 2 rows behind the suspected passenger. We have to get all the contact details of those people. They need to be protected. Different diseases, again, has different scenarios that you need to look at. We always page for medical assistance. Nowadays, most of the aircraft, bigger carriers, has got agreements with medical service ground service providers who can assist them, especially if there's something that you're not sure what you're dealing with. But otherwise, we have very often medical personnel traveling on board. And one of the important things they have to do during flight, one is a documentation. So you need to, we have a general health declaration on every aircraft where they have to report if there's been a sick passenger on board. They need to record the seat number, and that information is being handed over to the Public Health Department. The other thing is to decide whether you're going to divert a flight or not. So a flight diversion might be because of the condition of the patient. It might be because you want to divert the flight to a specific airport where there's more facilities to deal with it. According to our regulations, states may not refuse to allow entry of an aircraft carrying an infectious passenger on board. But they need to have procedures in place on where you're going to let that aircraft go if you don't allow them to all your international airports. When we had Ebola in 2014 in the US, they identified 5 or 6 airports, and all flights originating from certain airports or had passengers who might have been suspected of, well, not suspected of having Ebola, but having been exposed to Ebola, were funneled to specific airports where they had people in place and they had facilities in place to deal with that. Okay, now we get, this is a complicated slide and I'm not going to go through that. All you need to know is the aircraft is on the top And these are all the processes that takes place when you have a case of anything, any medical case, especially if you think there's a communicable case on board, you have to follow all of these. And it is communication between the air, between the ground, between the departure airport, between the originating airport, between public health, aviation stakeholders. It also involves immigration, the baggage handlers, because if you have a sick passenger on board, all of those things need to be managed. What happens with his luggage? What happens with his immigration? Where is he taken? To which hospital? So there's a lot of communication going on behind the scenes. Now, when we arrive at the airport, there's two things. Again, let's look at aviation first. Usually, we ask them to identify a specific parking spot. You will have forms that is being, so if you think that there might have been exposure, you will have passengers that complete the forms. The aircraft might be quarantined, might be isolated. We had a case in New York not too long ago with people that were sick on board. They didn't know what the cause was, so they were parked at one side of the airport. Everybody was kept on board. Public health boarded the aircraft, did an assessment, examined all the passengers, and then they decided to let the passengers go. So that was a good case. In a bad scenario, they might keep the passengers, or they might take them to the terminal, isolate them from other passengers until they know what the diagnosis of the disease is. What also happens at the airport is aircraft disinfection. So if we know it's an Ebola case, there's specific cleaning materials that we use. I need to go quicker. I don't have much time left. And the important thing for aviation people here is you cannot use any disinfectant or disinfectant on aircraft. You need to use things that has been approved for use by the aircraft manufacturer. Public health, already basically discussed that. So they can put them in isolation, they can do vaccination of all the people, they can put them in quarantine. Contact tracing is what we do when we complete these forms and we say you might have been exposed, or someone say there's been a passenger on board that might have had a disease, and then people will ask the passenger list, and we will follow up with these passengers and tell them, oh, you might have been exposed to measles, this is what you need to look out for. Okay, I have 3 minutes for 3 slides, I think, so it should work. What have we been doing? Again, with Ebola, we are using our statistics. So when this outbreak happened, we could say airports, these are the airports from which passengers traveled. This is the number of passengers. This is where they were traveling to. This is where the transfers were happening. So that helps WHO and CDC to say, this is where we need to do screening procedures. We can tell which airlines it is, so the airlines can do public health announcements, giving more information. That was historic. We also now have real-time information with our FIRS. So this is an app on the ICAO website. You go to Safety, Aviation, Medicine, and then the Infectious Disease app. And you can select the state, the airport, the time period for flights that you're looking for. And it can give you the exact number of departures from that specific airport, the destination countries, the specific airports where they are flying to. And you can also compare trends. So you can compare 1 year to a previous year or 1 month to a previous month. We also have the NOTAMs at the bottom of that page, which will tell you whether you need to have additional measures in place when you fly into that. And there's a link to the WHO website. These are the airports. This is the one thing we did for Ebola. So typically they're going to Ethiopia, South Africa. So that's how we know where they're going to. And my last slide, the airport vector control. We spoke about having airports free of mosquitoes. So this is again on the public website of ICAO, and there you can see which airports has got actual good vector control programs in place. We also use that for bilateral discussions between states. And this is the thing we're working at the moment, our aviation decision-making tool, where we look at the spread of the pathogens, we look at the spread of the vectors, we look at the aircraft routes, the type of traffic, the number of traffic, and then the destination country can decide whether they need to implement more measures or less measures to try and prevent the transmission of disease. And that is the last slide, and I have 10 seconds to go. Any questions? I have left my business card there, and there's also a training program that CAPSCA has implemented now for public health and for aviation on CAPSCA and how to prevent mitigation of disease. So you're welcome to take that, send me an email if you want more information, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ansa Jordaan.